In the last video, I dismantled a block and cracked open the case. Today, I'll be taking a closer look at the internal components and checking some measurements. Looking here at the camshaft still in the case, you can see the wear pattern and bits of debris. I wasn't really sure what to expect, but it seems this wear pattern is really nothing unusual. The more I've looked into it, it seems like the best way forward is to run a new cam altogether instead of having it reground. Apparently, the stock Type 4 cams ran hot. One thing I know for sure is that the more I read about cams, the more I learn that I don't know about cams. So basically, this will get tossed or sit on a shelf as a trophy. I gotta say, it felt pretty monumentous to take out the crankshaft, something I've definitely never done before. A couple of remaining bits here in the other case half is the oil pickup tube and windage tray. One thing people typically do with their Type 4 engines is they cut extra holes in the windage tray to increase oil flow. I haven't decided if or how I'm going to do that yet. Back to the other half. Looking at the crank journals, the middle journal has a remnant of the backside of the center bearing imprinted on it. It's not really raised or sunken though. It feels completely smooth and you can't catch your nail on it. The rods here rotated incredibly smooth on the crank. There's just the perfect amount of drag on them so they don't fall instantly. It's really a shame I'm taking this all apart because of how ideal this appears to be. Or at least that's the opinion I've heard. The main bearing closest to the fan hub, I think this is technically called number 4. It's got some heavy markings throughout, although it certainly feels smooth and the printed part number is still visible. Now, I know this type of micrometer is not meant to measure crank journals, but I think if you're careful enough and take your time, you can get accurate measurements. Here I got 59.95 in the middle and rear, and 59.97 in the front. I measured this over and over to get a consensus on these numbers. These are well within tolerance, and I should be able to run standard bearings and not need to have the case board. So I think that's ultimately what I'm going to try. Instead of using heat to remove the gears, I just went for it and used a gear puller. It was tough, but it worked out in the end. No notable wear or any damage here. I didn't film the removal of the rods, but I spent a good amount of time cleaning and detailing the crank, so I could really get a good sense of the condition of the journals. And they actually look incredibly polished. No notable concerning streaks, except for rods 1 and 3. They have a bit of a brassy looking smudge all the way around. I might need to see if I can polish that off. I also wanted to get a measurement on the roundness of the main journals, so I hooked up the dial indicator and spun it around a few times on each main journal while the crank is nested in these 2 blocks that I made up. You can see here between all of them, it barely ticks up or down 1/1000th, so I'm not going to let that concern me. I did a little bit of cleaning on the main bearings just to inspect them more closely. It looks like the frontmost bearing and the next bearing in line, I don't know what the numbers of these are, had wandered a little bit out of the dowel pin location. I'm not sure why or how this happens, but for that reason alone, I think they need to be replaced, as well as the dowel pins. The center and thrust bearings, though, looked okay. Moving on to the connecting rods. Starting in sequential order, rod number 1 has two parallel lines on both bearing surfaces that just barely catch your fingernail. The big end surface looked alright, some marking, but you can still see the cross hatching. The cap for number 1, however, had rusty patches throughout the surface. I'm wondering if this had to do with moisture trapped behind the bearing or if it was starved for oil somehow. I don't know. I cleaned it up with brake cleaner and a cloth with little to no effect. So I tried WD-40 and 1000 grit sandpaper. And that worked great. It shined up nicely and you can still see the cross hatching. I ended up touching up all the rods in the same way as I went through them. Overall, I'm going to say the rods are in good shape and probably just fine to reuse. Here's rod number 3 with more lines in the bearings. Notice that number 1 and number 3 had these lines, and the number 1 and number 3 rod journals on the crank also had those brassy looking streaks. And rod number 4. Not sure if these kind of markings are typical or indicative of something. I might have to just look into that a little bit more. The cylinder heads were a different story. These were very gunked up, and I wonder if there was some serious exhaust blow-by here. I'm not sure exactly what it looks like in real life, I've only seen it in photos. These heads did have cylinder shims inside, and I know one of them was slightly misshaped when I took it out. I'll just have to clean these up and reassess. Another thing I've never done before was removing valves. I got the cheapest valve removal tool I could get, and like most things, watched a bunch of YouTube videos on how this is done. They all came out pretty easily, but the exhaust valves were very crusty. I mapped them out on some cardboard to keep track of what went where, but I may just buy all new valves and springs anyway. With everything gone through, I boxed up the case, cylinder heads, and all the engine tin and brought them to American Metal Cleaning here in Portland to have them dipped. They did a fantastic job. Very pleased with the results. Also, check out this sweet 911 body they had on their floor waiting to be picked up. Now I can get a much better idea on the shape of everything and look closer into the journals for wear. The center journal has a fate imprint of the back of the bearing still, but it's far less visible than it used to be. I scrubbed it with steel wool to see if that made any difference, and it did just a little bit. I may try something else when I'm closer to putting this back together. The end journal, however, it cleaned up beautifully. And then taking a look at how the cylinder heads came out, not bad at all. Pleasantly surprised here how well they cleaned up. This one area I noticed, as did the metal cleaner, it looks like battery acid dripped down and corroded this a bit. It lines up with a similar corrosion mark on the case, as well as the tin in this area being completely rusted away. I know that people typically recommend buying new cylinder heads, and I may consider doing that here, but $1,000 minimum is a bitter pill to swallow. Another decision I'm up in the air about at the moment. Thankfully, the engine tins also came out okay. I had to paint them immediately due to how quickly flash rust was creeping in. I definitely didn't want to have to track down random engine tin. They are weirdly expensive for Type 4 stuff. Some of the metal was pitted pretty badly, like on the valve covers. I may go over this again with some kind of filler coat. Aside from that, just some sheet metal work that shouldn't be a big deal. Just some bends I'll have to figure out. And none of this has to be show quality or anything. That's going to do it for this video. Up next, I'll be moving on from engine stuff to focus on bodywork. Thanks for watching.